Welcome to Blue Dream Health Collective, where we talk about real health as well as chronic illness, self-care, mental health, and other interesting and educational topics. I'm the host, Misty Blue, a biomedical science major and a chronic illness warrior. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you love this episode.
Jimmy Fremgen from Sacramento, California, has worked as a high school teacher, travel writer, church youth leader, congressional aide, bartender, cannabis regulator, public affairs consultant, and community organizer. Honestly, I read your bio, and until now, I didn't think that I've met anyone that has as many passions, interests, and projects as I do. So, Jimmy, please introduce yourself.
Did you say zoo train driver? Did you
Oh,
get that
yeah,
one on there
I
too?
forgot that one. Well, was that for real? Tell me more.
That's real.
Oh, wow. I thought that was just like a last add-on.
No. So
just to be silly.
I worked my way through college, and I went to UC Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara, and we have a beautiful zoo there that's up on this hilltop.
Wow,
and
yeah.
Around the zoo, there's this awesome little train, and so that was my job. Every Saturday morning, I would peel myself out of bed and race down there to drive the kids around the zoo.
That actually sounds very fun.
It was very fun
cool.
Most of the time.
Yeah, so you've had a lot of things on your plate, not necessarily all at once, but I'm sure probably some of them. So tell me more about that. Because I know I'm the same way. Like, I'm a photographer, I'm a writer, like I have a long list too, and everyone's like, I don't know how you do it. So it's really cool meeting another person that has just so many cool interests as well.
Well, so it's funny because at one point in my life, like pretty much everybody looked at me as like the lovable screw up, because I was a high school kid that my parents looked at me and they said, like, at some point I looked at them and I said, what are you going to do? Ground me? I had already been grounded like in perpetuity. Like, I had lost all my privileges, everything. And so they were like, well, hopefully this kid graduates high school, because he's clearly smart enough to do it, but he's got such an attitude. We're so tired of dealing with his crap. And so, I'm lucky that I like had a really great mentor in high school. I had a high school teacher that like got me excited about learning again, and it kind of lit the fuse for getting excited about all these things. So you're right. Like, you listed a bunch of the stuff I've done. I went to because I wasn't any good at high school or wasn't paying any attention, I had to go to community college. I did my first 2 years of college in 1 year at my local junior college. Then I went to UC Santa Barbara. I majored in history, became a history teacher. Then I moved to DC. I worked for the House of Representatives in the United States Senate for 5 years. Ultimately, I became a congressional investigator for the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. And the ranking member at the time was Congressman Elijah Cummings. So I worked directly for Mr. Cummings for a number of years. And there I did a lot of really in-depth investigations. And so that's probably the time where I had the least amount of jobs, the least amount going outside, but probably the most intense job of, working from first thing in the morning and not going home, really.
Yeah.
Going home to sleep, eat, and then going back to work. But yeah, I try to stay busy.
I like that. Staying busy for me is that's like my version of being healthy, because it keeps my mind in a better place, I feel like.
Exactly. So, and I love to learn. So I'm always trying to get into new things. So, before I went to DC, I taught high school for 3 years. And the teacher inside me is just constantly like seeing stuff, wanting to learn about it, like picking up history books. My reading stack is always like really high. When I was in college, I'd start the semester with a pile of books on one side of my desk. And as I read through them, I'd go through to the other side, and they'd always be like this on either side.
Wow.
So I just love trying new things.
I love that you made it a point to mention that you weren't the best high school student, and so you went to the community college first. I love that, because I'm the same way. I was a horrible high school student, and I've also done the community college route as well. So I love that, as a younger kid, I feel like you think that it's like so detrimental to just do amazing in high school, and there's so much pressure, and it's good to know that you still have other chances to change your path or go from there?
Yeah, I think we put, just as humans in general, but especially as Americans, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be perfect all the time and to do
Oh,
everything
absolutely.
according to how other people want us to do them. And that's certainly the case in high school, right? If you don't have great SAT scores, you're not in the right advanced placement classes, you're not volunteering, you're not doing all this other stuff, you're not going to get into college. And that was the case for me. Like, I was plenty smart. I just didn't apply myself, didn't pay attention in class. I was more interested in like cutting class and getting McDonald's from across the street than I was in like listening to my math lectures.
Yeah.
And I survived. Like, it's not a path that I would encourage high school kids to take. Like, don't screw
Right.
around in high school because you can save yourself a lot of time and an energy.
Oh, yeah.
But like, it's possible to survive.
Mm-hmm. So I have a pacemaker and you have a pacemaker.
Sure do.
I want to hear more about your story. Tell me why you have a pacemaker and also tell me about the diagnosis process. So tell me more.
So, so I have always had heart disease. I don't remember what life was like before heart disease because there was no life for me before heart disease. I was diagnosed with a heart murmur at birth. And what that meant for me growing up in Northern California was that I was taking trips to University of California, San Francisco Medical Center several times a year to be followed by a cardiologist. And I reached a point actually when I was in high school where our high school was subdivided. So, and when I lived in Virginia, I realized that not everybody had classes at schools where there's like on this big massive campus, and a lot of people have like schools that are stacked on each other. We
Oh,
had
yeah.
the only high school in town that had a 2-story building.
Wow.
And because we don't have snow, right? So it's okay to walk in between your classes.
Yeah.
And we don't have oppressive heat like you guys have in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And I would climb to the top of the stairs to go to my history class, and I wouldn't be able to see straight. I'd be
Wow.
so lightheaded and short of breath from doing one flight of stairs as a 14-year-old that I would have to like prop myself up against the locker and just wait for my vision to come back. And so I just kind of like dealt with it for a while because I was a teenager and I was tough and stubborn and a pain in the ass. But eventually I ended up going to the doctor, telling them about it, and they sat us down, and me, my mom, and my dad. And I remember my doctor's name was Catherine Collins. I'll remember it viscerally for the rest of my life. She was my first electrophysiologist, which is the person that tracks how your electrical pathways work inside your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And she looked at us and she said, on the scale of white to black, with white being totally healthy, like Olympic athlete ready to do anything, and black being somebody like knocking on death's door, Jimmy is one of the darkest shades of gray.
Wow.
And for me, as a 14-year-old, like I just didn't know how to comprehend that. I had lived my whole life with this disease and just kind of like lived my life, just did whatever I wanted to do. I jumped BMX bikes. I, rode.
Yeah, it was your normal.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't know any
life.
better.
Exactly. And so she said, we strongly recommend that Jimmy gets a pacemaker. And we want to do it as soon as possible.
Wow.
So they scheduled me to have an ICD, an implantable cardioverter defibrillator. I can't ever remember exactly what it is. And it also had a pacemaker component. So a few months later, once the insurance company was able to make nice with the hospital and all that stuff, I went and got it put. And so I got it placed in the summer between my freshman and sophomore years of high school. And I've had one ever since. I actually just had my fourth one put in 3 weeks ago.
Dang. So what exactly was she what did the EP find? Did you have an official diagnosis? Were you having crazy arrhythmias?
Yeah, so I have something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which for people that don't know a lot about cardiology, basically your heart on the most basic level is 2 sets of chambers, your atrium and your ventricle. And in between your atrium and your ventricle, there's a thick wall called the septum. And most people, their septum is about a centimeter thick. And mine is about 3 times that. So what that means for me is that the interior volume of my heart is significantly decreased and how much blood can be ejected from it at any given time, just because like the size of my heart is totally normal, but the inside is, there's less capacity. But with that muscle being there, with that extra heart muscle being there, your heart is like a power plant. And so if you think about it with all these different electrical wires going every which way, running signal from let's say like the reactor down to the different places where you're sending that electricity, when you add in that extra muscle, you end up with all these weird little routes that aren't supposed to be there. And that can lead to very dangerous heart rhythms and things like ventricular tachycardia, which could be fatal. So to prevent that, to prevent my heart from sending these weird little jolts, or actually not even to prevent it, but to counteract it, they put in a pacemaker so that if my heart goes too fast, if my heart goes above 220 beats per minute, I get a big shock. I get a defibrillated shock. And if my heart goes below 50 beats per minute, I get little tiny jolts that speed me up so that I don't die in my sleep.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean,
crazy.
it sounds so callous to put it that way, but that's really what it comes down to. It's basically like, it's like living your life with bumpers on the bowling lane of your heart, right? If your heart goes too low this direction, it bounces back. If it goes too high this direction, it should bounce back.
Well, I'm just so grateful for medical technology, just to help, patients like you, patients like us, to have that safety net, essentially.
And it's something that's really interesting. And I don't know how you feel about this, but it's something that I've been reflecting on a lot lately, is since I was 14, I've had like an unbelievably expensive piece of equipment in my body.
Yeah.
Right. Like it sits right here in my chest. It sticks out. I'm generally in pretty good shape. And so it literally sticks out of my chest and you can see the outline of it. And so I've always had a Medtronic defibrillator until the most recent one. And then I switched companies. And so I'm absolutely very grateful for the technology, but it puts you into this very strange sense of relationship with these medical device companies and with the policies that govern them, because how our government decides on how we pay for medical devices and how medical devices get approved can literally affect whether people like you and I will live.
Absolutely. Which one did you switch to?
So I am now a Biotronic man.
Yeah, me too.
Is that what you have?
Yeah, but I don't have the defibrillator, just a pacemaker, the dual lead. Yeah, but it's cool.
Is wild. So yours is probably a little bit smaller than mine.
It's not too bad. They do have a new one that's like itty bitty, but
I've seen little
maybe
tiny
next
ones that are like
time.
the size of your thumb.
Yeah.
Mine's about this big. It sits like this is the bottom of it here where my thumb is, and this is the top of it, and it's about this wide.
Yeah, yours is a little bit bigger then. So it's cool because with the technology, like if I have any arrhythmias as you like, that'll be recorded, and so you can see once you get the interrogation everything that's going on. It's just really neat. I hope that eventually they get the app kind of set up with it so we can have a little more transparency and see more like what's going on. But I think they're working on that.
And it's really interesting to see how the technology has progressed, right?
Yeah.
Because like when I was a kid, when I got it put in high school, when I would have to go in to get it downloaded, I'd have to go in like every 2 to 3 months. I had a doctor, they would put a magnet over it that had like a big long cord that ran to like it looks like a Leapfrog laptop, right? Like the laptops that you give your kid so they couldn't break it, like this big plastic thing. And they'd be able to download all the information. But now they like put it on to identify that you're in the room, and then they just take it off and you transmit it over like Bluetooth or Wi-Fi.
It's pretty crazy.
It is. And I don't know. Sorry. I was going to ask you a question about yours. So when I go in to get my pacemaker programmed, I have to go in every few months to do this now. The tech will check to see if the wires that go into my heart are still good. They call it lead impedance testing. And they will speed up my heart artificially to see how well they conduct the electricity. Do you ever get that?
In the beginning, it's a little bit crazy because they have to keep checking the settings and make sure, and probably since you just switched, and this wasn't too long ago, they were probably just making sure, because I had a lot of appointments in the beginning, and I remember my settings were kind of crazy. I'd go in, I had a complaint with one of the settings was too high. Because mine, if my blood pressure bottoms out, because normally what I used to do is my heart rate and blood pressure would just plummet. It has this therapeutic setting where it'll kick in my heart rate and it'll speed my heart rate up to try to counteract my low blood pressure to kick it back up. And they had it pretty high in the beginning, which felt to me it was like PTSD. I was like, oh my God, my heart's, I'm having an arrhythmia. Help.
Yeah, you'll be like sitting totally still, and it's all of a sudden like you did the 40-yard dash.
Exactly. Right? Yeah. So and it freaked me out. And honestly, in the beginning, they didn't even realize that it was that. They thought it was my actual heart. So they kept upping my medication. And after research, I was like, oh, I think this is what's going on. And then they checked the setting and they lowered it. So now, like on my Fitbit, if I look at my watch and it's at 100 exactly, I know that it's the pacemaker, not me. So, because when I feel it, it's like I feel that fluttering, and it's hard sometimes to differentiate, from the heart versus the pacemaker. So that's been kind of like my little how I've been able to figure that out is just when it's exactly at 100 and I'm just sitting there, I'm like, okay, I'm okay.
Yeah. And it's the weirdest feeling because, I don't know how you feel, but for the most part, I feel perfectly healthy, right? Like in my head, like I said, this is just something I've grown up with. And so I'll be sitting totally still. And then all of a sudden it's like, it's like having a near miss in your car or something where your heart rate just shoots through the roof, but I'll be sitting on the couch like reading.
Yeah, that's crazy. So besides the pacemaker, looking forward, is there anything you can expect with the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy moving forward? Like, would you ever need any other type of treatments or procedures, or just mostly kind of maintaining the pacemaker and defibrillator?
So hopefully not, right? Less surgery, more better.
Right.
But I've had at least, I can think of off the top of my head, 7 different heart-related procedures over my life. Most of them were as a teenager. I've had 2 different experimental surgeries.
Oh, wow.
To counteract arrhythmias. One of them was to deal with that lightheadedness that I was having. So I am hopeful that I will not, but odds are probably, right? It's a very serious disease.
Right.
My mom had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and it killed her when she was 45.
Wow. I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. But it was very real for me because when she passed away, I was 19. And so,
oh, wow. And you just got the diagnosis and going through all of that. Wow.
Right. And it was like 5 years after I had been diagnosed and got my pacemaker placed. And my mom was a nurse. And so she was like my safety blanket for this stuff. She understood it. She had the disease. She had a defibrillator. We could talk about it. She could go to the hospital with me. And all of a sudden, one day she was snatched away from me by this disease. And so it really put it in perspective for me at the time to take it very seriously and not be careless with it.
Right.
But for me, the way that I try to prevent having to have any other complications is I try to take responsibility as much as I can to prevent bad behavior. So, I'm not perfect. I work at a bar when things are not in the middle of a pandemic. Like I drink. One of the things that you and I have talked about is I use cannabis every once in a while to help treat anxiety symptoms. So it's not like I'm not living my life, but I try to exercise and I try to keep my stress down and I try to be really attentive because I watched my mom, and my mom gave everything to us. She was in nursing school while she was raising 3 elementary age kids. She was drinking so much coffee to survive that she burned out her thyroid. And I
Wow.
love and miss my mom so much, but I don't want to repeat some of those same behaviors that will shorten my lifespan because I'd really like to have her here and I want to be able to be there for my kids someday. So there's a
Right.
lot of personal responsibility that we can take to try to elongate our lifespans. And I'm kind of on that train.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say like we have to give ourselves a chance and the
Mhm.
opportunity by, with our lifestyles and even just those minor tweaks and whatever we can to help. Like I said, give ourselves a fighting chance with our chronic illness.
Totally. And it puts it in perspective, right? For people like you and I who are young, you know that nothing is guaranteed, right? Nothing is promised. And
Hmm.
so you have to go out and hustle to get it done. And so I've had people tell me in my life, like, why are you working so hard to get that done? This happened when I was working on Capitol Hill, right? I would go meet with people and take coffee meetings and go after projects. And people would say, well, why are you doing that? Like, you just started here. There's no reason to do that. And I think deep down for people like you and I that have chronic illnesses that know how beautiful, fragile, and valuable life can be, you have that kind of underlying sense of hustle where you know that like I got to go get it because I don't know how long I'm going to be around here.
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. So many people in the chronic illness community hear things like, you're too young for that, or you look fine, or you don't look sick. Is this something that you've personally dealt with or experienced?
Totally, totally. And they say that until I unbutton my shirt and show them my scar, and then they're like, "Oh
Yeah.
shit, it's real."
Right. Are
um,
there any incidences or experiences that you can list off the top of your head that maybe are significant with that?
Yeah, the thing that comes to mind right away is I've worked in public service almost my entire life, in my entire career, I should say. And that started with time teaching, but like I said, I then went and worked for Congress, and then when I moved back to California, I worked for the California State Legislature. And what that has meant is a lot of the time I've been working in places with metal detectors.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the way that metal detectors interact with defibrillators is like my defibrillator is always looking for a bad heart rate, right? If something goes wrong with my heart, it's there to save my life. And it can be looking for anything irregular. And so when you go through a metal detector, it puts in this electromagnetic interference, and your pacemaker sees that as this.
Oh, wow.
And then you have like 7 to 8 seconds for it to evaluate the heartbeat, decide if it's going to kill you, and then administer a shock. And so if I go through a metal detector, my pacemaker sees this. It goes, oh my God, Jimmy's about to die. It starts charging the battery and getting ready for a shock. And so every day when I would come to work, I would
Oh,
have
wow.
to explain to the police officer at the door, I have a defibrillator. And then I would have to kind of, depending on if I knew the officer or if we had a relationship or I had my card with me or whatever it was, I would have to negotiate my way around the metal detector. And sometimes, and this happens at airports too. So
Hmm.
sometimes I have to get a pat down. Like sometimes they're very thorough pat
Oh,
downs.
yeah.
Sometimes they're really quick. Um,
Always.
but a lot of the time, it just means like there's a cop on the other side or a TSA agent of this metal detector saying, come on through. And I'm standing there holding up the line and trying to explain to them, like, I can't go through or I don't want to because it freaks me out and I don't want
Yeah,
to
because
get
sometimes they try to, like, they know better and they're like, oh, no, you're fine. This is a
right.
safe. And I'm always like, no, just, I would prefer not to, just to be safe.
Exactly. And so, like, I'll tell you, like, if the first time you walk through, if you go through quickly and the metal detector doesn't go off, you're fine. But if like, let's say I'm wearing a big chunky belt that day, and if it goes off, then they're going to send me back through, take off my belt, and go through. So
So
that
that
goes
timer's still going.
exactly. And so it goes, my pacemaker doesn't have the opportunity to say, oh, his heart is beating normally. So I'll go through once, I say, I have a defibrillator, and they say, well, just go back. But in my head, I'm counting, okay, half a second through, half a second back. Like I'm trying to think about what the defibrillator is doing, and getting defibrillated is not enjoyable.
That's what I was going to ask. So when you get shocked by the defibrillator, from what I've heard, I've never experienced it or seen it. I heard that you go on the floor. Is that true?
So I have been fortunate. I've only been, they call it a therapy, and it's the most aggressive therapy I can imagine. But I've only been shocked preventatively once. What they do when they put the pacemaker in the first time is they hook you up to these wires that fish down into your heart, and then they test it. And it's supposed to happen while you're unconscious. The first time that I had, actually, the second time I had mine replaced, I don't know if my anesthesia was off or if it was wearing off or the surgeon wasn't fast enough, but whatever it was, I was conscious, but paralyzed. And so I woke up as I was getting shocked, and I remember feeling this big thump and seeing a big white flash. So now I'm very intentional when I go in to get my, like this last time when I got my pacemaker replaced, I looked at the anesthesiologist and I said, unless you can guarantee me that this isn't going to happen with the normal dose, you better make sure, because I don't want to go through this. And I'm definitely calling you back afterwards if I wake up while I'm getting shocked, because it's just not an experience worth repeating. But the time that I remember fully where I wasn't under anesthesia was it was while I was in grad school, and I was coming back from parent-teacher conferences. I was teaching high school in San Luis Obispo County in California. I was running late because I'm always running late. And I had stopped by 7-Eleven because this was my favorite thing to do. You know, when you're broke in college, you find little ways to spoil yourself. So I would stop and get a giant Slurpee, and I love Dr. Pepper. So I had chugged this giant Dr. Pepper Slurpee, which is just chock full of sugar and caffeine.
Oh, wow.
I was stressed out. I was sprinting up a flight of stairs. I had a load of books on my back. And when I got to my front door, I put the key in and I couldn't find the keyhole because I was so jittery.
Wow.
And so I was like, man, my heart is really racing. So I like walked, I was living by myself. So I like walked inside and I tried to get my pulse, and I checked, and I was like, it was so erratic that I couldn't get a pulse. Right. So I'm like looking at my watch, trying to do the math and everything. I was like, well, I better sit down. And so I sit down, try to get my pulse again. Nothing. Or not nothing, but it was, I couldn't track it.
Too crazy.
So nothing would have been really bad.
Yeah.
And so I just thought, I was living alone, and I thought to myself, it's amazing how fast the normal life stuff goes away in those moments, because I thought to myself, if my heart doesn't slow down, I'm going to pass out and I'm going to die alone in my apartment. And so I got off the couch, I opened the front door, and as I opened the front door, I remember getting shocked. And so it was like getting hit in the chest by my mom used to say it's like getting kicked in the chest by a horse. I have no idea what that's like. I've never been kicked in the chest by a horse.
Right.
But I liken it to like getting tackled in football unexpectedly, where like all the air gets knocked out of you.
Oh, okay.
I saw this big white flash, and the next thing I knew, I was face down on the sidewalk in front of my apartment.
Wow. At least you were outside. So did someone find you?
So I woke up and I looked up, and my neighbor across the way was coming out of their apartment, and they were going somewhere. And I looked up and I yelled, "Help!" And the guy like looks at me across the street like, "What?" And I was like, "Help!" And he's like, "Seriously, bro?" Right, we're in college. And I'm like, "Yes, help me!" And so he came across the street, walked over, and I'm like on the ground on the phone with 911. And he said, like, and I like get off the phone, and he said, "What do you need?" And I said, "I just had a heart issue. The ambulance is on its way. I need you to do everything it takes to keep me awake until then."
Wow.
And he like looks at me, and I could just see his mind was just being blown. And it was at that moment that I realized that he was stoned out of his mind.
Oh no.
Oh, like no. This poor guy is just having the worst trip. And so, you know, we sat there and waited for the ambulance. And as I heard the sirens, I was wearing a sweater vest at the time because I was so cool. And I go to peel it off, and the guy's like, I'm like taking my shirt off and my sweater off. And he's looking at me like, "Dude, like, what are you doing?" And I go, "Look, when they get here, the first thing they're going to want to do is get to my chest to put an EKG on me to see if I'm okay. And the fastest way to do that is with a pair of scissors, and I like this shirt.
Oh no.
So when the
Wow.
ambulance got there, I was like sitting there shirtless.
You're like,
sitting there
I'm
with my shirt
ready.
unbuttoned, ready. I'm just like, save me.
The things that are normal. Oh man. So I'm a huge advocate for cannabis. This industry is growing and doing a lot of amazing things, but there's still a lot of people that are stuck on past stigmas. So tell me your thoughts on the cannabis industry. I know that you're a little bit involved, right?
That's right. So as I mentioned, when I came back to California from DC, I was thinking I'll either teach or I'll stay in politics. And the fastest job I could get was in politics. So I became a committee staffer for the California State Assembly Committee on Business and Professions, which had jurisdiction over all of the licensed health professions in California. And 2 weeks after I started was Election Day 2016, when California passed Proposition 64, which legalized cannabis.
Cool.
And 3 weeks after that, my boss, who was in charge of cannabis for our office, went out on maternity leave. And so she said, you're my backup. It's all you. And so for like 6 months while she was out on maternity leave, I had to learn about this product that I knew nothing about, and that I had actually actively avoided because I had heart disease, and I was scared that it was going to put me in some terrible heart rhythm and kill me, which is not what you want. So
No.
I had the chance to, I not even the chance, I had the job to dive in really deeply and learn everything I could about it, because all of a sudden I was the most senior committee staffer in the state assembly in charge of creating this regulatory system around cannabis.
Oh, wow.
And so I had to like take a crash course. So we held hearings, and I was part of a working group where we worked.
Was part of your crash course trying it?
It was. But I am happy to say that I only ever have purchased cannabis legally and consumed cannabis since it was legal.
That's cool.
In California, at least. But, you know, like one of the first things I did was everybody was telling me what a joke the medical marijuana card system was in California. And so when cannabis was first legalized here, you couldn't buy it at a dispensary without a card. And so I said, well, I'm going to go see a doctor and see if I can get a card. I want to know what this is like so I can figure out how we should be writing the laws. And I walked in. I have anxiety. And so I just diagnosed. I didn't make it up so I could get a medical marijuana.
Okay. Okay, that's what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, I saw your face.
I've got glaucoma.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got glaucoma. That's the.
No, I am a big believer in transparency about mental health. Like I was going to therapy all the time. I was working through some personal struggles at the time, and so I definitely had like a diagnosed anxiety condition. I went in.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of most people, I feel like with chronic illness or an invisible illness, definitely deal with the mental health aspect for sure.
Totally. Like I walk around with a box in my chest that at any minute could give me a life-altering electrical shock, and I have no control over that. And so even separate from all of the other things that are happening in the world, like that's really stressful.
Yeah.
Or can be. So yeah, I went in and I got my card like that. I think I was in and out in 10 minutes, $45 later. I was a legal cannabis patient. And so, I tried it. I got some. I talked to my cardiologist first and I said, what should I, like, is this even safe? And he kind of laughed at me. And his advice was, he said, you are on medication to slow your heart down because we're worried about it going too fast. Cannabis is only going to slow your body down. And if it goes too slow, you have a pacemaker that's going to speed it up. So, and he just kind of laughed and he's like, no, so we don't worry about it. And then he goes, but wait, as your doctor, I want to be clear. No one should inhale any sort of burning substance. It is bad for you, no matter what it is. And I said, okay. And that was it. Very
cool. So it's only $45 there. I I think it
Well, that was then.
was.
Now it's more
Oh, okay.
expensive. The system,
Okay.
the system has changed now. But yeah, I'm willing to bet it's a lot harder to get legal cannabis in Florida than it is in California.
Yeah, we do every 7 months. Is I'm coming up on my recert here next week. Actually, I'll be doing my recert. I think it's 75 for the state. I feel like the first time, I want to say, I could be wrong. I forgot. I don't know if it was 75 or it was like 150 maybe.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not 100%.
Well, and it's tough, right? Because there are different
Yeah.
laws in every state, and we all operate in this world where it's federally illegal. And so a lot of folks that have been using cannabis as medicine or have been working in the industry for a long time remember what it was like to like have their houses raided by federal authorities.
Right.
And so there's this very strange, bizarre patchwork of laws around the country that make it really hard for people like you and I that just want to be healthy and just want something that's going to get us through the week. And you have to negotiate through all of this complicated process. So yeah, it's tricky. I can't imagine what it's like in Florida. Here, I mean, it's famously easy to get weed in California.
That's awesome. Can you tell me a little bit about Spark the Vote?
Yeah. So since I left the state legislature, I did several years there in this role with the committee evaluating all of the legislation that came through on cannabis policy. And when I left, I wanted nothing to do with politics. I was super burned out on it. I didn't
Oh,
want to talk
wow.
to anybody I used to work with. I had a very complicated experience here in California. And so with the political system. And so I left and I opened up my consulting firm and I only work on projects that I consider contributing to the public good. And
Oh,
so
cool.
my first client was a client that was creating a Pride Month themed edible gummy.
Oh, nice.
From Kiva Confections. They're the #1 cannabis edible in the country. And so we worked with drag queens to do the packaging and make sure that it was a good tribute to them. We worked with the LGBTQ plus community to make sure that folks knew that we weren't trying to take advantage. In fact, we were trying to give back to that community and raise awareness. And so one of my latest clients is Spark the Vote. We are a nationally organized campaign to mobilize cannabis voters to vote and get involved in elections at the local, state, and federal level. So we, during the election this year, we were active in 13 different states. We mobilized like thousands and thousands of people that voted on cannabis. And the cool thing about this is that it truly is a nonpartisan issue. We know that in 2016, 1 in 3 cannabis consumers that voted for Donald Trump. So you just assume that it's like this big liberal hippie thing,
right?
Nobody outside of like this offshoot of liberal politics supports, and that's not true. More than 80% of Americans favor some form of legalized medical cannabis.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's astronomically high, but a lot of the time, the only people that we only hear from are legislators that have this really, really narrow view of what cannabis policy should look like. So Spark the Vote is committed to getting information out, but also empowering consumers so that we can actually build reasonable, effective policy around an issue that is truly a consensus issue. Right there, it's hard to imagine right now, especially with how polarized things are in our country, that you could get 83% of Americans to agree on like their lunch order, much less a political issue. But in cannabis, that's the case. So that's the work that we're trying to do.
I love that. So I understand you're also very interested in civic engagement. Could you share a little bit about your experience with your time on Capitol Hill?
Yeah. So I feel bad. We could talk about this for like days.
Well, you can also send me, any extra stuff that we leave out in this conversation, and I'm gonna have a blog post. So any extra stuff you want to include in there, it'll be available for the episode notes.
Awesome, that would be great.
Yeah.
So let's see. I talked about I used to be a teacher, right? So I fell in love with history in my 11th grade year, and it was U.S. history, and so I've always been really interested in American political history. I majored in it in college. I taught political science and US history, and then I went on and worked in the federal government. So it's always been something that's really interesting to me. And it was funny because when I got to when I moved to DC, I was like, oh, I'm just gonna teach, right? I had moved out there because I was in a relationship and my partner had gotten a job out there. And I was like, well, I'll just teach. My teaching credential is usable anywhere. So we'll do that. And I couldn't get a teaching job. So I went and interned on Capitol Hill. And when I was looking for a paid job, I would go into interviews and I was maybe a little bit too self-assured, which my friends would be shocked by. But I went in and I was like, well, I know how politics works. I used to teach it. So I want to work here and see what it's like in person. And people would literally laugh at me in job interviews.
Oh,
because
wow.
the reality of how politics works is so drastically different than what we learn in our textbooks and in our classroom.
That's interesting. How so? In a nutshell.
In a nutshell. So I think most Americans, at least until recently, right, most millennials and back think of I'm just a bill, Schoolhouse Rock, when they think of how Congress works and how the federal government works. And mechanically, that is true. But when you think about how a bill can get passed into law, you probably think it takes like a couple months, but it can take decades.
Wow.
An idea from the time that you think about it and put it to paper and get it approved to the time that it gets signed by the president and gets enacted into law. So what happens in between is a ton of relationship management and relationship building. So I'll give you an example. When I worked for Mr. Cummings, I was there during, unfortunately, the tragedy in Newtown, where several dozen elementary school aged kids were shot and killed in their classroom. And there was a huge surge of gun violence prevention legislation that came out of that process. And I was in charge of a bill that we were working with one of our committee members, Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney from New York, on eliminating straw purchasing and gun trafficking. It's not currently illegal, and nobody take this as a good idea, but it's not currently illegal to traffic guns across state lines for criminal purposes.
Wow.
And so we were trying
to
solve that. I know, and people assume that it's illegal, and it's just not. You can, if you buy a gun in Florida and you send it to somebody in Georgia, and let's say that I was somebody who wasn't legally allowed to own a gun. I was on a list of people that weren't allowed to own a gun, whether I was a former felon or somebody on, well, I was going to say somebody on the no-fly list, but Congress blocked something a couple of years ago to prevent people on the no-fly list from buying guns. So if I was a person that was prevented from owning a firearm, and I called you and I said, Misty, I want to rob a bank next week, but I need an AK-47, and I know they're legal in Florida. Can you buy me one and send it to me? And you're like, no problem. That's called a straw purchase. You're the straw man that goes and buys it and sends it to me, and I go commit a crime. That's not currently illegal, and that was what we were trying to make illegal federally. So to do that, this was a bill that had already been created. Congresswoman Maloney had been running this bill previously to when Newtown happened, but we really wanted to put a lot of energy into it because we really believed that this was a bipartisan piece of legislation that we could get across, because you shouldn't be able to buy a gun for somebody that wants to kill somebody and
absolutely, yeah.
But right now, the only penalty for you in that case you would get the same penalty as if you lied on your form for your passport. The crime is a violation of a federal form, which no prosecutor in the country is going to prosecute. Nobody's going to actually do time or get in trouble for. It's like it's a slap on the wrist at best and nothing at worst. So in order to try to get that passed, we had to talk to gun violence prevention advocates. So we worked with Everytown, which is former Mayor Bloomberg's anti-gun violence committee. We worked with a lot of celebrities. We worked with gun advocates and said, hey, how can we work with you to get this legislation? How can we do the language? And this is all before we even introduced the bill. And then we had to go out, and I was in charge of getting co-sponsors, which are people that agree with what the author is trying to do formally, and they put their name down so that you can build momentum. And so I went out and talked to Republican offices and said, we're doing this thing. We want to do it with Republicans because we believe that it's something that makes our country better. And we think it's something that you can believe in too. And they agreed. So we were able to get Congressman Rob Ridgel from Virginia and Congressman Pat Meehan from Pennsylvania. Neither of them are in Congress anymore, but they came along with us and we introduced it. And that was just the first step. That was all before we even dropped it in the hopper and had it printed in the record. So then you go from there and you do speeches and press calls and interviews, and you try to make the case publicly that this is something that you need to do. And none of that is on School of Rock, right? School of Rock is you introduce the bill, you hear it in a committee, the committee might make an amendment, then it goes to the floor, it gets voted on, then you repeat that process in the Senate or in the other house, wherever it started, and then it goes to the president's desk. And that's not the case in Congress. In Congress, the answer is no until you convince people that the answer can be yes.
Wow. That sounds very tough, and like you'd have to really, there's a lot to learn, I would imagine.
It's exhausting. And, you know, we, at the time, the House Representatives was Republican controlled. And so we had a pretty strong feeling that we weren't going to have an opportunity to hear it out of the House. But we did get the same bill put into a package in the Senate. And that was the package that would have mandated background checks federally for firearms. And so we'd been working on this for months. We had talked to the parents of children who had been gunned down in their seats. Like, it was an incredibly emotional and intense process. And you meet people and you think, like, how could anybody vote against this? And we lost. It's still perfectly legal to do those things. So
that's got to be really frustrating.
It can be demoralizing. And there's a lot of people in Congress that like drink really heavily because of that kind of process. And so you have to really gird yourself against those letdowns and really believe in what you're trying to do, because you come back. And this is why I say it can take decades, because even if you get to that point, even getting it scheduled for a vote on the House floor or on the Senate floor is unbelievably difficult. Like, less than 10% of bills get scheduled for a vote and less than 5% get passed.
So I was just watching, I think it was the Christmas movies that made us on Netflix last night. And they're talking about Elf and how difficult it was to get that picked up so that, you know, so this whole thing, I'm just relating it to that experience, how they were a bunch of nobodies and everyone was turning them down. And it was just, it barely happened. It seems a lot like the movie industry, just trying to get your movie picked up, and the piles and piles and piles of, you know, bills that are just sitting there collecting dust. That's got to be tough.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Is that there are some bills that get introduced and you just know right away, like, they're not going to go anywhere. And then there are other bills that are going to be really pushed. Like right now, Congress, I don't know when you're going to put this out, but right now Congress is considering two major pieces of legislation that are going to affect everybody in the country. One is COVID relief legislation, which they've been considering since August and ignoring, and millions of people are suffering because they can't get their crap together and pass it. But the other thing is a funding bill to keep the government open. And so when you introduce a funding bill, you just assume it's going to pass. But like a COVID bill, the House passed a bill to give additional relief in early summer, and the Senate hasn't acted on it. So here we are in December, people are suffering. We know that the virus is exploding right now, and we don't have that kind of support. But one bill that is definitely going to get passed in some form at some point is a funding bill, whether that's through a short-term extension or it's a new round of funding for an additional year. So there's different kinds of categories for things that definitely move, for things that don't move. But it can be tough. If you're trying to like change the world, you're not trying to just keep the lights on in the government or fund the military or things that people consider absolutely essential. You could be on that project for months, days, years.
So what keeps your feet planted in that industry?
Hope. Because the thing is, as a teacher, I sold my students this story that I had learned, that people had sold me, that government was for the people, by the people, and it was accessible to everybody. And then you get there and you find out that's not actually the case. You find out that it's actually government by a few people for even fewer, and that's about it. But the thing that makes me hopeful is this is a place that has rules. This is a place where you can literally grab the book and find out how it works and get in there and do it, right? So we see this in sports all the time, right? With like, there are dedicated lines. You have like in baseball, right? Whatever happens in between those chalk lines, as long as you're following the rules, you can outclass everybody else. And that's possible in politics too. And what it really comes down to is education. And so what I try to do with my inner teacher that's always screaming in my ear is educate people about what some of the opportunities are that they have to actually make a difference in that space. So this summer I launched a YouTube channel. It's just at Jimmy Fremgen, youtube.com/Jimmy Fremgen on YouTube. And I have a series on there called Politics for People, where every week I put out a video that breaks down a complicated concept in government and explains it in plain language so that more average folks can understand it and do something about it. Because as long as we continue to ignore how government is supposed to operate, the people that are willing to go inside government and learn about it are going to make it operate in a way that works for them because they know that the rest of us don't care and aren't savvy enough to do anything about it. I think that that's a fundamental problem that is easy to fix. It's something that we can learn bits and pieces and get in and actually do something about it. And cannabis is a great example of that, right? Like cannabis is now legal in some form in almost 40 states. And a big part of that, there were, I think, 4 or 5 statewide ballot measures on the ballot this November, and every single one of them passed because voters are going around their elected officials and creating legislation that they actually believe in to get it done. And the only reason they're able to do that is because they're learning about what the process is like. There's no reason we can't send people to Congress and send people to like local to run in local races, to be in our local
right,
to be in our mayor's offices that can believe in the way that we want government to be. We just have to learn about it enough and do the time to like volunteer for them and walk districts and get them elected so that we can have a government that works for us.
Yeah, it's like a grassroots thing. I mean, if you think about it, even in healthcare, or anything really for that matter, just if you're wanting a change, I feel like that's what is kind of heartbreaking about all of this is a lot of people want that change, but we all kind of sit there and wait for somebody to do something about it. So I would love to, maybe learn more, whether it's another episode or challenging you for like a YouTube inspiration video for you to put out in the future, how people can get involved. I know for me personally, I would love to learn more about policy making in healthcare. That would be something I would love to learn about because, again, I think that's why a lot of patients in our community with invisible illnesses, they get so frustrated with the treatments they've dealt with or being, medically neglected or, some type of traumatic experience in the healthcare world that it pushes them to get involved somehow, which is why I'm involved in biomedical science. And, but I would love to learn more about that. That would be a really cool topic.
Well, and the place that people should go to learn more about that, at least for me, is my Instagram, my Twitter, and my YouTube, right? And I know that you're going to put those links up, but
absolutely,
I want to have a conversation with people because if there's something that you want to learn about, I want to help. I want to help you learn about it because I can't fix everything and nobody's expecting me to fix everything. But if we get a movement of folks together that are willing to pick up the phone and call their congressman, it's going to happen. Like I was a congressional intern for Congresswoman Doris Matsui, who represents me right now here in Sacramento. And when I was working for her, we had SOPA on the floor, which was the Stop Online Piracy Act. And it was a bill that would have significantly decreased the rights of people that use the internet. And so on the day that the House was scheduled to vote on it, Reddit, Netflix, and a bunch of major internet providers went dark and put links up on their websites that said, here's the link to find out who your congressman is and how to call them. And our phones rang nonstop. And that bill went from being a surefire bill that was going to get passed and was going to fundamentally alter the way that we experience the internet to being completely dead just because we were tired of answering the phones. Like, it's possible to make a
Wow.
change. We just have to have informed and willing people that are going to do the work. And it doesn't always have to be a lot of work. Like, the cool thing right now is that the pandemic has broken open our political structure. So right now in Georgia, we have 2 Senate races that are going to determine whether the House or whether the Senate is controlled by Republicans or Democrats in the next 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And you can phone bank, you can sign up to call for whichever candidate you believe in, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. You can sign up and you can call from your house. And we can have thousands and thousands and thousands of people getting involved to make a difference in places that they don't live in a way that we never had the opportunity to do before COVID. So there are more and more opportunities to get involved and to make a difference. You just have to be willing to spend the time. And I know it's disheartening and I know it's a lot of work because I've done it. It's exhausting and it can be terrible. But for every time that you call somebody and they say, screw you, I'm tired of getting your phone calls, you get onto the phone with somebody else that's so grateful that you're taking the time. They want to talk to you. They want to learn about what you're doing. And it gives you hope that we can be better than what we are right now.
That's amazing. I love that. Very cool. Well, do you have any last minute words to throw in there before we wrap up?
I'm not ever short on words, but I would say, like, if somebody's interested in politics, if somebody wants to make a change in their community, go do it. Just start. And if you think, like, as somebody who has worked in politics for most of their adult life, I have met a ton of elected officials. I've worked for 5 different elected officials, and I know a lot of people that are more qualified than most of those people that I've worked for directly. And if you don't think that your vote matters, I recommend that you go walk around the halls of Congress and meet some members of Congress, because a lot of those people shouldn't be there. So I'd say the first step is getting involved locally and trying to make a difference in your community, because you're going to do things like, if you don't want to lose your parking space out front, like, you can call your council member and make that happen. Like, that's very doable. And you can get your neighbors to do that with you, and you can scale that up to whatever problem you have. And then if you want to do more than that, run for something. Whether it's a local city council, water board, your utility board, your school board, if you want to run for Congress, I mean, it's going to be a lot of work, but, like, it's possible. And I guarantee that most of the people listening to this are far more qualified and capable than the majority of the elected officials that we have around the country. And we need,
I love that.
everybody. So get out there, find out how to do it. If you don't know how, hit me up on Instagram and I'll point you in the right direction. Let's make a change together.
I love it. I will be hitting you up. Maybe I'll run for something at some point.
You should. Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be cool. Well, thank you so much. I've learned a lot, and I feel like there's still so much more to learn. So I'm really excited about this.
Yeah, bring me back anytime you want to geek out on government. I'm ready.
Awesome. Thank you.
Please be sure that you subscribe to the blog, which is bluedreamhealth.com, where you can find additional links and information on this episode. You can also check out the digital magazine on our website, as well as find us on Patreon, where you can be a supporter.